Snoop Dogg refuses to switch seats. One call later, an entire team gets fired. Picture this, a first-class seat isn't just a seat, it's a statement. It's a battle of entitlement versus earned success. And when Snoop Dogg found himself face-to-face with privilege in its purest form, things took a turn no one expected. Power dynamics flipped midair. Karma delivered instant justice. And one phone call changed everything. This is more than just a story about a seat. It's about standing your ground when the world assumes you'll step aside. If you believe in doing what's right, hit that like button, subscribe for more real stories, and drop your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the smallest stand shakes the biggest empires. Now, let's dive into what really went down. Snoop Dogg leaned back in his plush first-class seat, exhaling slowly as the hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin. After a whirlwind week of back-to-back performances, this flight was supposed to be a moment of quiet before another major milestone, finalizing an international concert deal that could take his career to new heights. The sunset outside cast a warm orange glow across the tarmac, the scent of fresh coffee and designer perfume lingering in the air. Everything felt just right. Until it didn't. A commotion near the front of the cabin pulled Snoop from his thoughts. He glanced up, spotting a tall blonde woman stepping into first class with the kind of presence that demanded attention. Everything about her, the way she held her designer handbag, the way she surveyed the cabin like she owned it, screamed entitlement. Trailing behind her, a brunette companion murmured something in response to the blonde's annoyed whispering. Snoop caught fragments of their conversation. "Can you believe this seat assignment? Unbelievable. Maybe it's just a mistake," her friend replied nervously. Snoop's grip tightened around his leather briefcase. He'd seen this before, people who measured his worth by assumptions rather than accomplishments. The blonde, Elizabeth, stopped beside his row, tapping manicured fingers impatiently against her handbag. Snoop kept his focus on his briefcase, uninterested in whatever she was about to say. But of course, she said it anyway. "Excuse me," Elizabeth's voice was clipped, her tone laced with practiced politeness that barely concealed her irritation. Snoop looked up, meeting her gaze. "Here we go. I believe there's been a mistake," she said, gesturing toward his seat. "This is obviously meant for someone else." Snoop raised an eyebrow. "This is my seat. One I reserved weeks ago." Her lips curled into a tight smile. "You see, I'm a gold-tier member with this airline. I always get priority seating. You might be more comfortable elsewhere." Snoop let the moment hang in the air, watching as her entitlement twisted into impatience. "I'm quite comfortable right here. Thanks." Her smile vanished. Before she could press further, a flight attendant appeared, his uniform crisp, his posture professional. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, eyes flicking between them. Elizabeth wasted no time. "Yes, there is. My seat has been mistakenly assigned to someone else, and I need it corrected immediately." The attendant turned to Snoop, hesitant. "Sir, may I check your ticket again?" Snoop handed it over without a word, his heartbeat steady. He'd been here before, on stages, in boardrooms, and subtle confrontations where he had to prove he belonged. This was just another test. The attendant examined the ticket, nodded, and looked back at Elizabeth. "This is indeed Mr. Dogg's seat." Her expression tightened. "That can't be right. He must have bought a last-minute upgrade. People do that, don't they?" Snoop held her gaze, unbothered. "I suggest you take your assigned seat. This conversation is over." Elizabeth's friend tugged at her arm, whispering something urgent, but Elizabeth wasn't ready to back down. That's when Snoop made a call. One call. And by the time the plane landed, an entire team was fired. Sometimes, the most powerful revolutions start with just one seat. Snoop Dogg stands his ground, entitled passenger learns a hard lesson. A first-class seat isn't just a seat, it's a battleground. And when Snoop Dogg found himself in the crosshairs of privilege, things escalated fast. A quiet moment turned into a silent standoff, and one woman's entitlement went head-to-head with a lifetime of earned success. But power doesn't always sit where people expect it to. What happened next left an entire cabin in stunned silence, and by the time the plane landed, the consequences were undeniable. If you believe in standing your ground, hit that like button, subscribe for more real stories, and drop your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the smallest refusal sends the loudest message. Now, let's get into what really happened. Snoop leaned back in his plush first-class seat, flipping through his leather-bound notebook, his thoughts on upcoming concert plans. The hum of the airplane engines mixed with the soft clinking of glasses as flight attendants moved through the aisle. It was supposed to be a quiet moment before another career milestone. But peace doesn't always last long. A faint commotion near the entrance of first class caught his attention. The cabin door had just opened to let in the last passengers, and in walked a tall, elegantly dressed woman, platinum blonde hair swept into a pristine updo. She was flanked by another woman struggling under the weight of an oversized designer tote. She moved with the air of someone who expected the world to accommodate her. Snoop barely glanced up, but he caught the subtle narrowing of her eyes as they landed on him. He had seen that look before, a silent question wrapped in quiet judgment. "What are you doing here?" The woman's posture stiffened. She raised a manicured hand and waved down a passing flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said sharply, impatience sharpening every syllable. "There must be a mistake. My seat is supposed to be here." The young flight attendant, his uniform crisp but his demeanor slightly uneasy, offered a professional smile. "What seat number, ma'am?" "1A, of course," she replied, barely glancing at him. She gestured toward Snoop with a flick of her wrist, as if directing attention to a misplaced object. "But clearly, there's been a mix-up." Snoop exhaled slowly. He already knew where this was going. The attendant checked his tablet and smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but 1A is correctly assigned. Mr. Dogg booked it in advance." Her jaw tightened. "And what am I supposed to do about that?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "I am a very loyal customer of this airline. Surely there's something you can do." The attendant hesitated. "We can try to arrange." "There's nothing to arrange," Snoop interrupted, his voice calm but firm. He met her gaze directly, unwavering. "This is my seat, and I intend to keep it." A flicker of something crossed her face, disbelief, then irritation. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I'm sure you'd be more comfortable in another seat. Perhaps in business class?" Snoop didn't move. He'd been underestimated in boardrooms, dismissed in meetings, forced to prove himself in places where his presence alone was questioned. "I'm perfectly comfortable where I am," he replied evenly. The cabin air seemed to tighten. Other passengers pretended not to notice, eyes glued to their tablets and books, but their curiosity filled the space like static electricity. The flight attendant shifted, clearing his throat. "Mr. Dogg, would you mind moving to another seat? Perhaps 2C? It's still in first class, and it would allow us to accommodate Mrs. Stokes." So that was her name. The kind of name that came with country clubs, generational wealth, and the assumption that the world bent to her will. Snoop leaned back in his seat and folded his arms. "I booked this seat for a reason," he said, his voice steady. "I won't be moving." Elizabeth's face darkened. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Snoop to hear. She turned back to the flight attendant. "Do you even know who I am?" "I'm a Platinum Elite member." "I don't think this is how you want to treat one of your most loyal customers." The attendant swallowed, glancing between them. Snoop could see the hesitation in his eyes. He knew Elizabeth had connections. But he also knew Snoop was in the right. Finally, the attendant spoke. "I'll get the supervisor." And with that, he disappeared down the aisle. Elizabeth turned back to Snoop, her lips curling into a forced smile. "You could have avoided all this, you know," she said, her voice saccharine, insincere. But I suppose some people just don't understand the meaning of compromise. Snoop tilted his head slightly, studying her, his expression unreadable. Compromise, he repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the word. Interesting choice. By the time the plane landed, one phone call had changed everything. Elizabeth Stokes, Platinum Elite member, was no longer a Platinum Elite member. And the airline? They had a very public apology to make. Because sometimes, the most powerful stand isn't loud. It's just refusing to move. Snoop Dogg holds his ground, entitled passengers' meltdown ends in instant karma. A first-class seat isn't just about comfort, it's a statement. And when Snoop Dogg found himself in a silent battle with privilege, the tension in the cabin thickened with every passing second. One woman was determined to take what she believed was rightfully hers. But Snoop? He wasn't about to budge. By the time the plane landed, the fallout was swift, the lesson was clear, and one phone call had changed everything. If you respect standing your ground, hit that like button, subscribe for more real stories, and drop your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the quietest stand speaks the loudest. Now, let's break down exactly what happened. Snoop Dogg remained seated, fingers lightly gripping the armrest, his expression unreadable as Elizabeth's frustration grew. Her confident smirk wavered as a new figure entered the scene, a middle-aged woman in a crisp airline uniform, heels clicking sharply against the cabin floor. The flight supervisor. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone calm but firm as her eyes flicked between Snoop and Elizabeth. Elizabeth wasted no time. "Yes, there's a problem. I'm supposed to be in seat 1A, but somehow he ended up here." The supervisor's gaze lingered on Snoop for a brief moment, recognition flickering in her eyes before disappearing just as fast. But she kept her professionalism. "Mr. Dogg, would you be willing to move to another seat? Just to resolve this quickly?" The request hung in the air, a silent expectation pressing down on him. He could feel it, the unspoken demand to be reasonable, to yield for the sake of peace. But peace isn't built on giving in to entitlement. "No," Snoop said simply. Elizabeth let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Unbelievable. You're really going to make a scene over this?" Snoop smiled faintly, but his eyes remained steely. Without a word, he reached for his phone, typing out a message with deliberate calm. He had dealt with people like Elizabeth before. He knew exactly how this would play out. The supervisor, Diane Lewis, shifted uncomfortably. She was a seasoned airline professional, trained to de-escalate conflicts. But this wasn't just another passenger complaint. She could tell Elizabeth Stone wasn't here because of a mix-up. She was here because she expected to get what she wanted, no matter the cost. Diane glanced at Snoop again. There was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet authority that didn't need raised voices or threats. "Mr. Dogg," she tried again, keeping her tone neutral. "I understand your position, but for the sake of resolving this quickly, would you reconsider moving to another seat? It's still in first class, and—" "No," Snoop interrupted, not even looking up from his phone. His voice was steady, controlled, final. Diane pressed her lips together, glancing at Elizabeth, who was now pacing a small circle in the aisle, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Diane," Elizabeth snapped, her voice dripping with entitlement. "I don't understand why this is even a discussion. He's being unreasonable. I'm a Platinum Elite member. Do you know what that means? I've spent more on this airline than he probably makes in a year. I deserve that seat." The words hit the cabin like a slap. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, shifting in their seats, but no one spoke. The weight of her statement, its meaning, its implications, was undeniable. Snoop finally looked up. His gaze locked onto Elizabeth's, his voice smooth, but edged with steel. "Mrs. Stokes," he said, slowly, deliberately, "your membership status has nothing to do with me. I paid for this seat just like you paid for yours. If the airline made a mistake, that's their problem, not mine." Elizabeth's cheeks flushed. Her confidence cracked. This isn't about the money, she snapped. It's about respect. Snoop tilted his head slightly. Respect. The word rolled off his tongue like an afterthought, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in the air. I didn't mean it like that, she stammered. I just meant, well, you're clearly not a frequent flyer in first class, and I. Snoop held up a hand, cutting her off. Stop, he said firmly. Elizabeth recoiled slightly, but quickly masked her discomfort with a haughty toss of her head. Fine, she spat, turning back to Diane. Are you going to let him get away with this? Diane felt the entire cabin's eyes on her, the weight of expectation pressing down. She had spent years prioritizing customer satisfaction, de-escalating situations, and making accommodations. But this wasn't a case of resolving a seat dispute. This was something else entirely. She exhaled, then spoke, her voice carefully measured. I'm afraid Mr. Dogg has the right to remain in his seat, she said at last. He booked it, and we cannot force him to move. Elizabeth's face twisted in fury. Unbelievable, she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. This is the kind of service I get after all the money I've spent on this airline? I'll be speaking to corporate about this, mark my words. Snoop smiled faintly, setting his phone down. You do that, he said. By the time the plane landed, Elizabeth Stone was no longer a Platinum Elite member. Because sometimes, the strongest stand isn't loud, it's just refusing to move. Snoop Dogg's silent power move leaves entitled passenger in shock. What happens when privilege meets quiet power at 30,000 feet? Snoop Dogg just wanted to enjoy his first-class seat in peace. But when an entitled passenger decided she was more deserving, things escalated fast. She brought in backup, she made demands, and she played every card in the book, except one thing she didn't count on: Snoop doesn't play games. By the time the flight took off, one call had changed everything. If you respect standing your ground, hit that like button, subscribe for more real stories, and drop your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes, power is knowing exactly when to make the right move. Now, let's break down how it all went down. Snoop remained cool, eyes on his phone, barely acknowledging Elizabeth's meltdown. But she wasn't done. Spinning on her heel, she stormed down the aisle, muttering about entitled people and incompetent staff. Diane, the flight supervisor, exhaled a quiet sigh of relief. It didn't last long. Moments later, Elizabeth was back, with reinforcements. A nervous-looking flight attendant named Gary trailed behind her, his face tight with unease. It was clear Elizabeth had gone looking for someone who would take her side. She refuses to cooperate, Elizabeth announced loudly, as if Snoop were a disruptive child. She gestured at him like an accusation. I demand that you do something about this. Gary hesitated, looking at Snoop, then at Elizabeth, silently asking Diane for direction. Before Diane could respond, Snoop moved. Slow. Deliberate. He stood up. The cabin stilled. Conversations hushed. The tension tightened like a drawn bowstring. Snoop reached for his phone, pressed a button, and suddenly, the soft sound of a ringtone filled the cabin. Then, his voice was calm, even, but razor-sharp. I didn't want to do this, he said, his voice slicing through the air. He glanced at Gary, then at Diane, his eyes cool and calculating. But since you've decided to escalate, I'll escalate too. And just like that, he turned his back on Elizabeth and spoke into the phone. Yeah, it's Snoop. I'm currently on one of your flights, and I'm having an issue with the staff. No, I'm not looking for compensation, I'm looking for accountability. The blood drained from Diane's face. Gary shifted uncomfortably, hands clasping and unclasping in front of him. Elizabeth frowned. Confused. She had assumed she had the upper hand. Snoop continued, his voice unwavering. I'll expect a response before we take off. And if I don't get one, I'll assume this is a systemic issue and take it to the board. Silence. Then, thank you. He ended the call, slipped his phone back into his pocket, and turned to Diane with a faint smile. "Now," he said, his voice soaked in quiet authority. "Let's see how corporate handles this." Diane swallowed hard. She didn't know the full extent of Snoop Dogg's influence, but she knew one thing: this was a battle she couldn't afford to lose. The hum of the engines was the only sound in the heavy silence that followed. Snoop sat back down, flipping open his leather notebook with the same casual ease as if the conversation had already been resolved. His movements were calm, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had played this game before and never lost. Diane remained standing, her usually confident posture faltering. "Take it to the board." Those words echoed in her mind. She had dealt with difficult passengers before. But this wasn't about a simple seat dispute. This was something much bigger. Elizabeth, however, was a woman who didn't believe in losing. Arms crossed, manicured nails tapping against her sleeve, she was seething. The smug smirk she once wore had vanished, replaced by a deep scowl. "Well?" Elizabeth snapped, turning to Diane. "Are you just going to stand there and let this nonsense continue?" Diane hesitated. Gary, still behind Elizabeth, stood rigid, clearly desperate to not be involved. This was the choice. Side with Elizabeth? Risk Snoop's wrath. Possibly damage the airline's reputation. Side with Snoop? Upset a high-paying, platinum elite member. But one thing was becoming clear. Snoop wasn't just another passenger. Diane took a breath. "Choose wisely." "Mrs. Stokes," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I assure you, we are handling the situation. Please take your seat for now, and I will follow up shortly." Elizabeth's nostrils flared. "Take my seat?" "Take my seat," she repeated, her voice hitting a sharp pitch that made several passengers wince. Then, her finger jabbed toward Snoop. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Snoop had heard those words too many times before. Without even looking up, he flipped another page in his notebook. As if her tantrum was no more significant than the faint rustle of paper. And that silence? That disregard? It ate her alive. "I demand to speak to the captain," she shrieked. "This is completely unacceptable. If you won't fix this, I'll take it up with someone who will." Diane stiffened. The captain? Calling the captain into a passenger dispute was a last resort. It could delay the flight. It could escalate everything. "Mrs. Stokes," Diane said carefully, her tone laced with warning. "Please understand, the captain's primary concern is the safety of this flight. This matter does not warrant his involvement. Let's resolve it here." But Elizabeth wasn't having it. "Oh, I see how it is," she snapped. "You're protecting him because you think he's more important than me? Well, let me tell you something. If I'm not in that seat by the time this plane takes off, your airline will be hearing from my lawyers. One phone call. That's all it took." By the time the plane landed, Elizabeth Stone was no longer a platinum elite member. Because sometimes, the strongest move isn't loud. It's knowing exactly when to play the right card. Snoop Dogg stays unshaken, entitled passenger gets a reality check. What happens when confidence meets entitlement at 30,000 feet? Snoop Dogg didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. While an entitled passenger threw every demand, threat, and connection she had at him, Snoop remained cool, calculated, and completely in control. But when the captain stepped in and corporate got involved, the situation took a turn no one saw coming. By the time the plane landed, one career had changed forever, and it wasn't Snoop's. If you believe in standing your ground, hit that like button, subscribe for more real stories, and drop your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the quietest moves make the loudest impact. Now, let's get into what really happened. Snoop sighed softly and, with a quiet thud, closed his notebook. Calm. Steady. Unmoved. He placed the leather-bound journal on his lap and looked up, his eyes meeting Elizabeth's with an expression that was equal parts cool and unyielding. Mrs. Stokes, he said evenly, if you truly believe your lawyers can resolve this, by all means, proceed. Elizabeth blinked, caught off guard by the quiet authority in his voice. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, her confidence faltering for the first time. Snoop leaned forward slightly. It means, he said, that throwing your weight around might work in some circles, but it won't work here. Not with me. And certainly not with the board members who will be reviewing this incident. He sat back, his expression unreadable but his eyes razor-sharp. So I suggest you take your seat before you embarrass yourself any further. The air in the cabin turned electric. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, pretending to be focused on their screens, but everyone was listening. Diane, the flight supervisor, stood stiffly, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Elizabeth's face burned red, her jaw clenching as she searched for a response. But before she could say another word, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the silence. Ladies. All eyes turned. The captain had entered the first-class cabin. His uniform crisp. His expression unreadable. His presence alone commanded attention. Even Elizabeth fell silent. What seems to be the problem here? He asked, his gaze sweeping over the tense scene with practiced neutrality. Diane stepped forward quickly, trying to de-escalate before it spiraled further. Captain, we're handling a minor seating issue. There's no need for your involvement. The captain didn't blink. I'll be the judge of that, he said calmly, but firmly. He turned to Elizabeth, who immediately launched into a dramatic rant about her platinum elite status, her loyalty to the airline, and the injustice of being denied her rightful seat. The captain listened, expressionless. When she finally finished, he turned to Snoop. And you, sir? He asked, his tone softer but still professional. Snoop met his gaze without flinching. No, Captain, he said simply. I paid for this seat, and I intend to stay in it. If the airline made a mistake with Miss Stokes' reservation, that's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to fix. The captain nodded. His eyes lingered on Snoop just a moment longer than necessary, then he turned back to Elizabeth. Mrs. Stokes, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, I understand your frustration, but this seat was properly assigned to Mr. Dogg. I must ask you to return to your assigned seat so we can proceed with the flight. Elizabeth's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. A fish out of water. But that's final, the captain said, cutting her off. If you refuse, I will have no choice but to remove you from this flight. The cabin inhaled collectively. A sharp, stunned silence followed. Elizabeth's head snapped around, searching the faces of nearby passengers, looking for support. None came. Even the people who had been avoiding eye contact minutes ago weren't on her side anymore. She turned to Diane. Nothing. To Gary, the nervous flight attendant. Nothing. She was alone. Meanwhile, Snoop calmly picked up his notebook and reopened it, flipping a page as if the entire situation had already been resolved. He didn't need to say another word. Everything was already unfolding exactly as he expected. Elizabeth clenched her fists so tightly her manicured nails dug into her palms. She turned her furious glare to Snoop. This isn't over, she hissed. Snoop didn't even look up. And for Elizabeth, that was the greatest insult of all. Her furious footsteps echoed down the aisle as she stormed back to her assigned seat. The tension in the cabin lingered, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint rustle of passengers shifting, exhaling the collective breath they had been holding. The captain gave Diane a small nod, signaling the matter was settled, then returned to the cockpit. Diane exhaled quietly, her hands tightening around the clipboard she held. The situation was over. For now. But she could still feel it in the air, the weight of what just happened. Elizabeth might have backed down, but her expression had promised retribution. And then there was Snoop. Silent. Composed. But undeniably powerful. Diane had a feeling this incident wasn't over. Not really. Snoop ran a finger along the edge of his notebook, grounding himself in its familiar leather texture. This wasn't the first time he had encountered entitlement like Elizabeth's. It wasn't even the worst. But something about this felt different. Maybe it was the audacity of it. Maybe it was the hesitation from the crew. Maybe he was just tired of it all. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. A notification. Incoming call, Marcus, Corporate Affairs. Snoop smirked faintly. Yeah. This wasn't over. By the time the plane landed, one career had changed forever. And it wasn't Snoop's. Snoop Dogg's quiet power move ends an entitled passenger's reign. Snoop Dogg boarded his flight expecting peace. What he got was a battle of privilege versus quiet power. When a platinum elite passenger demanded his seat, the airline's crew hesitated, torn between policy and influence. But Snoop? He didn't flinch. With one phone call, corporate got involved. The tension in the cabin grew thick as two sharply dressed men arrived, their presence alone shifting the atmosphere. Diane, the flight supervisor, and Gary, the attendant who backed Elizabeth's entitlement, were removed on the spot. The message was clear. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about accountability. As the dust settled, corporate made their final decision. Snoop was given a formal apology, 2 years of complimentary first-class travel, and a promise of change. Elizabeth? Stripped of her platinum elite status and escorted off the plane. Weeks later, the airline quietly introduced new diversity training and stricter policies on handling passenger disputes. The incident on Flight 827 wasn't named, but everyone knew the tables had turned. A simple act of entitlement ended with a lesson in respect. Power doesn't always need a raised voice. Sometimes, it's just refusing to move. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share to spread the message. See you in the next one.